Good morning, everybody. I most warmly welcome you here for the first Sustainability Standards Watchers Conference 2022, here in the room and in the digital space. My name is Katrin Böhning-Gaese. I'm a representative of the Frankfurt Panel on Sustainability Research, a group of academics from different disciplines, finance, law, climate, biodiversity, that have organized this Watchers Conference. What is this all about? Why we are here? And as a biodiversity researcher, I'm drawing here the bigger picture. Our planet is changing. In the past 70 years, since about 1950, we have an acceleration of many socio-economic processes, increasing human population, increasing GDP, increasing wealth, health, and in parallel, we have an acceleration in many ecosystem processes. Connected with the increase in population and wealth, we have an accelerating energy demand, carbon emissions causing climate change. We have an accelerating need for agricultural products, for food, for housing, which is causing land use change, forest loss, and as a consequence, the loss of biodiversity. So there's an increasing worry that we are reaching planetary boundaries, tipping points, where we have an irreversible changes in the Earth system with profound impact on human wealth, health, and well-being. Natural scientists now regard climate change and biodiversity loss as a double crisis for the planet and for humanity, with the biodiversity crisis potentially being even worse. Climate change will influence how, as humans, we will live in the future. Biodiversity loss will eventually decide whether, as humans, we can live on Earth in the future. In response to these fundamental challenges, we have changes in public perception and in policies. You all know about the multinational agreements for climate change, for example, the Paris Agreement. We have a similar agreement for biodiversity, the Convention on Biological Diversity, where the big 10-year meeting is in December this year. But we have also direct consequences for companies and finance. These changes in the Earth system create financial risks. The Global Risks Report of the World Economic Forum listed this year the most severe risks over the next 10 years, and place 1 is climate action failure, place 2, extreme weather, and place 3, biodiversity loss. There are physical risks. A loss of a protective forest upstream of an infrastructure can cause intense harm, and we know just a year ago here in the Ahrtal there has been a major flood where more than 135 people died, and the costs were almost 30 billion. That was the most expensive natural disaster in Germany ever. There are transition risks, changes in regulation, changes in consumer preferences. But we need to consider also the impact of companies on climate and biodiversity. A negative impact of a company on climate and biodiversity is noted by consumers, by employees, but also by regulators and investors. And as a consequence, investors are increasingly calling for standardized reporting by companies on climate and other ecological matters, and hence a number of initiatives have been launched to define standards on sustainability reporting that ideally are of high quality, transparent, reliable, and comparable. And our most prominent initiative, and this is why we are here, is the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, that just launched and published its first 2 prototypes, and I'm sure Erkki Liikanen of the ISSB will cover this in his part of the introductory remarks. There's also other initiatives in Europe, EFRAG, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, that also recently published its first standards also for consultation. Now, what is the objective of this conference? We, the Frankfurt Panel on Sustainability Research, have organized this Watchers Conference with a mission to provide a neutral platform for science-based critical assessment and evaluation of these sustainability standards. We would like to promote a dialogue among biodiversity, climate, economic and legal scholars on the one hand, and financial industry, policymakers, central banks and the ISSB on the other hand. The focus will be the purpose of and the conditions for effective international standard setting, and the 3 interdisciplinary panel discussions will center around questions that address the impact of these ecological standards for corporations and capital providers. Again, I most warmly welcome you here in Frankfurt. I'm certain that we will have a most interesting and relevant discussions. On the one hand, we will discuss here sustainability standards and the role of and consequences for companies, investors. But on the other hand, we are also addressing here planetary challenges and the contributions we can make for a thriving planet, for ourselves and for future generations. Thank you very much for your introduction, for your attention.
Thank you very much, Katrin. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, first of all, I want to thank Frankfurt Panel for Sustainability Research for organizing this first Sustainability Standards Conference, first of many which are going to follow, I'm convinced, when I've seen the commitment of many participants here. Science-based assessment and evaluation is critical to all the work for sustainability and also for sustainability standards. We are very happy to engage with the research community. The speakers, panelists and participants represent on the one hand climate, and here very much also biodiversity, economic and legal scholars, which all are very important fields for sustainability. And on the other hand, policymakers, central banks, we will have Sabine Marri here later today, and International Sustainability Standards Board. Makani published a book more than a year ago where he wrote about climate change with the title Tragedy on the Horizon, How to Break It. After well-structured analysis, he defines 3 building blocks for the solution. First, public policies. Second, company transition plans. And third, disclosures of climate-related risks and opportunities. These all 3 pillars are important. Public policies, of course, have a fundamental role. There especially the carbon tax, which has been supported by a great number of leading economists, if not all. Christian Gollier, professor from Toulouse, has written extensively on this item. The country which I know well accepted the first carbon tax in 1988, albeit on a low level. But in addition to these public policies, massive private investments are needed for the company transition, and to attract this private funding, disclosures of climate-related risks and opportunities is essential. Patrick Bolton and Marcin Kaperczyk have published important papers on the pricing of the transition risks. Disclosure is critical for the assessment of the enterprise value of the entity, and it has an inevitable impact on the pricing of the transition risks. I'm happy to learn that Martin will be here in a panel this afternoon, together with many other distinguished scientists. In COP26 meeting in Glasgow last November, IFRS Foundation made an announcement to establish an International Sustainability Standards Board. Its work is progressing according to the plan. We started with its chair, Emmanuel Faber, and Vice Chair Sir Lloyd, who is with us today, but now little by little it will be complete. We also announced a consolidation of the standard setters, and this consolidation of standard setters is in the final phase. We will be able to reduce the alphabet soup in this area. We spoke about alphabet soup here in this house 2007, 8, and 9. That is during the financial crisis. I was member of the ECB Governing Council, key item. Also here in some conferences, key theme. I'm very happy that Jan-Peter Kranen is the chair of the last concluding panel. We worked a lot after the crisis to find solutions to the banking structures. Not easy, but that direction has been taken. The global baseline is the key concept in the exposure drafts which will be presented by Sue Lloyd, Vice Chair of the ISSB. Work to establish the global baseline has been welcomed by G7, G20, the International Organization of Securities Commissions, IOSCO, Financial Stability Board, and many others. But implementation of the global baseline will require actions by many, by public authorities and by market participants. After the first two standards have been adopted, just IOSCO will play a key role in endorsement. We are happy to have Martin Maloney, the Secretary General of the IOSCO, with us here today. Climate in particular, but also biodiversity and other sustainability issues are global. Capital markets are also global. If you want optimally use capital markets for the change, disclosure standards should be global. There should be a global baseline. Jurisdictions can complement this with their specific requirements, which can be based on other aspects than enterprise value. In today's world, we see a lot of fragmentation and decoupling. Some speak even about deglobalization. This has been especially the case after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but even before. It is very important that emerging and developing economies, the global south, is an essential partner in the process. So the famous French report prepared by Olivier Blanchard and Jean Tirole said that if China and India are out of the climate battle, you can't win it. I want to thank you once more for organizing this conference. And I'm very happy that Professor Lucrezia Reichling is with us here today. She's not only a merited scholar in economics, but she was also the chair of the task force of the IFRS Foundation, which proposed and prepared the change to the sustainability for the IFRS Foundation, which is now new responsibility parallel to the financial reporting. Thank you very much. I wish you a very good, successful conference. First of many. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for these kind introductory remarks. We just jump into the first presentations, and I'm handing over here to Mrs. Sue Lloyd, the Vice Chair of ISSB. She supports the chair, will present here basically the backbones of the International Sustainability Standards Board. She is a member of the ISSB since 2014 and Vice Chair since 2016. She has played a leading role in the establishment of the ISSB, and I'm looking very forward to your introduction.
I'm delighted to be here today and hoping that my slides are going to magically appear. So I'm really delighted to be here today and thank you for the very kind introduction. What I want to do this morning is to really give you a bit of background to the establishment of the board, to give you some colour in terms of what the objectives of the board are and how we hope to be part of the global infrastructure supporting sustainability disclosure and addressing sustainability issues for the world, and then to talk a little bit, not too much detail, about the content of the exposure drafts. As Erkki mentioned, the IFRS Foundation has established a new international sustainability standards board with a mission of trying to do what the IFRS Foundation really did for accounting, now for sustainability reporting. So for those of you who are not familiar with the IFRS Foundation, let me start there just for a second. So the IFRS Foundation was established in the early 2000s with a mission of developing accounting standards to bring high quality transparency to investors around the world using a common language, really with a mission of making sure that wherever you were in the world, if you picked up a set of financial statements prepared using IFRS accounting standards, you could be confident of making valid comparisons between companies. And I think everybody would say, I think, that the IFRS Foundation has been extremely successful in that regard. So now more than 140 jurisdictions around the world require the use of the IFRS accounting standards for the preparation of their financial statements. So it really has achieved the dream of improving transparency and comparability around the world for investors. And it's really because of that success, I think, that we've led to the establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board within the same IFRS Foundation structure, which is set up as an independent standard setter to ensure that we really protect the needs of investors around the world, that we have a sister board that's now really been established in the vision, if you like, of the Accounting Standards Board to be very similar in structure. So the mission of the International Sustainability Standards Board is also to bring this transparency and comparability around the world for the benefit of investors. So in 2020, as Erkki mentioned, Lucrezia was actually tasked with doing the analysis that led to the consultation by our trustees. So the trustees provide oversight for the Accounting Standards Board, ensuring that we're independent and putting in place the institutional arrangements for our standard setting. And in 2020, they undertook a consultation to ask whether we should do something from a foundation perspective in the sustainability space. So the trustees, following from Lucrezia's work, undertook a consultation in 2020, and they asked the world really three questions. Is there a need for a global set of sustainability standards? If there is a need, should the IFRS Foundation play a role in establishing the global set of sustainability standards? And if the IFRS Foundation plays a role, should that role be to set up a sustainability standards board like the Accounting Standards Board within the IFRS Foundation structure? And I think we were delighted to receive a really overwhelming positive response from around the world. Over 750 letters from around the world from all types of stakeholders, investors, companies, regulators, audit firms and others saying, yes, there is a need for a global set of sustainability standards for the benefit of the world, and yes, we want the IFRS Foundation to play a role, and we want a new board to be established as a sister board to the International Accounting Standards Board. And it's so very much with the demand from the market that the IFRS Foundation decided to establish this board. The Foundation trustees were very clear from the start that it wasn't us looking for something to do, we were responding to a need in the market to provide a service in the public good. And that's what's led to the establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board. So we were really delighted that at COP26 last year, the Foundation trustees were able to announce the establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board. And I often say that it was probably the worst kept secret in the market by the time that it was announced. Everybody sort of knew that the International Sustainability Standards Board was going to be established, but it was great to have it confirmed at COP26. What was, I think, the big news flash at COP26 was the fact that we had agreed to consolidate with two existing standard-setting bodies. So rather than just establishing a new International Sustainability Standards Board, the trustees also announced that we were going to reduce the alphabet soup and build on the work of others by establishing the ISSB, and in so doing, building on the work of two really important voluntary standard setters, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the CDSB, and the Value Reporting Foundation, which houses the SASB's Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and the Integrated Reporting Framework. So we weren't starting with a blank sheet of paper. I think the other thing that we were all really pleased to do at COP26 was to put on the IFRS Foundation's website 2 prototype documents which showed the idea of what our sustainability standards would look like to give the new board a running start. So 2 prototype documents were put on the board, put on our website, and they form the foundation for the exposure drafts that I'll talk about a little bit later in my presentation. I'm going to go back just for a second because my memory wasn't totally perfect and cover this slide. So one of the things that the Foundation trustees really wanted to try to tackle, which came through from the research that we had been doing, was the complicated environment that everybody was dealing with. Many companies were trying to do the right thing, trying to provide information to the market about sustainability risks and opportunities and what the effect would be on their businesses. And investors were very keen for this information. So as a result of this demand, a number of standard setters had stepped up and developed proposals or requirements and recommendations for good disclosure about sustainability. So it wasn't as if there was nothing happening in the market. Sort of on the contrary, the exact opposite was happening. There were lots of different initiatives with lots of different areas of focus. Some were focused on investor needs, some were focused on broader public policy needs, but they were all voluntary, largely voluntary, and we had a situation where a single company may not only, 2 different companies may not only use different standards, one company may choose bits and pieces of different disclosures. And so as a result, both for companies trying to work out what to do and for those consuming the information, it was a very complex landscape. So one of the things that we were really trying to do with the establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board is to establish a less complex, more consistent and comparable environment of information around sustainability disclosures. And that context is important because by consolidating with the Climate Disclosure Standards Board and the ISSB, we automatically took some noise out of the system by taking 2 of the voluntary initiatives and deciding to build on their work. So that's the background to our new board. So what have we done since then? So since the announcement in COP26, we've made significant progress in terms of establishing the board. And I want to talk about some of the key things that have happened and why they're important. So the first thing about the ISSB, which is different to its sister body, the Accounting Standards Board, is that we have a multi-location footprint. I'm sure many of you know that our home is actually going to be in Frankfurt. I'm going to be based in Frankfurt as Vice Chair of the new board, so we're delighted to be based here. But we also have an office in Montreal, where we were a few weeks ago, and we have a presence. We will have another office in Asia. We're working on the exact details of that at the moment. And we have the benefit of our heritage organisations, the CDSB and the ISSB, being based in London and in San Francisco. As a result of this, we are spread around the world in a good way, because that means that we're going to be close to our stakeholders around the world. It means it's very easy for us to tap into expertise and knowledge in local markets, and that's a really important part of our work because, as I'll talk about in a moment, we really want to build a model which is suitable for global application. So the multi-location footprint is a really important part of the power of the International Sustainability Standards Board. Since December, we've been very busy with announcements and appointments with the new board. Ultimately, we will be 14 board members, most of whom will be full-time board members, the same size as the International Accounting Standards Board. And so far, we have announced the appointment of 8 members, and actually that means we're now quorate, and we're really excited that next week we will hold our first board meeting here in Frankfurt. So this is the cast of characters that we have so far up here on the board, ably led by Emmanuel Faber as chair, who was announced in December, who comes to us with preparer expertise and a deep sustainability knowledge. My appointment was announced next. And if you look at the other people that we have on the board, I think the thing that I would note is that we're trying to be very diverse both geographically, gender, but also with the skills and expertise that we bring to the table. We have on our board a couple of academics. Richard Barker and Jeff Hales are both academics, so they bring the academic knowledge and expertise to the board. Verity Chaga joins us with an investor background, so she brings an investor perspective to the board. Michael Jancy established Sustainalytics. For those of you who are sustainability data junkies, you might know about Sustainalytics. So he comes with knowledge of digital information and the use of sustainability information. And Ndidi worked as a preparer, really using sustainability reporting in Africa. So she brings real-world experience of sustainability application. So we're really trying here to make sure that we've got a broad range of views and perspectives in our board membership. And with the next 6 appointments, you'll see us further building out this real diversity of skills and perspectives. And our board members will be located in our different offices around the globe, brought together for board meetings, but spread around the world, again, with this objective of really understanding our different stakeholder perspectives around the world by really being on the ground. Now, another thing I'll note about standard setting is that I think the core skill of a standard setter, a good standard setter, is not knowing the answers, but knowing who to talk to and how to listen and what questions to ask. And I think the advisory group structure that the new board has in place is testament to that ambition. So if you look at us here, you can see we're surrounded by supporters. That's how I like to look at this graphic. Otherwise, we're in a circle and we can't escape. And we're really looking for input from those who really know how to help us get a globally acceptable baseline of sustainability disclosures. So I'll talk for a moment about some of the ways that we get advice from these people. Up the top, you can see we have 2 councils. These are advisory councils, IFRS Advisory Council and a new one, the Integrated Reporting and Connectivity Council. They provide advice actually not just to the ISSB, but also to the trustees and to the Accounting Standards Board on the strategic direction of the 2 boards. And the new Integrated Reporting and Connectivity Council is in particular focused on giving us advice on how the 2 boards should work together and how the financial statements and the sustainability reporting should work as a package. So that's strategic advice from those 2 councils. We then have technical advice, and we have technical advice in at least 3 different forms on this chart here. The technical reference group is preparers, providing us with advice, companies providing us with advice on the practical, operational and application issues of what we're proposing, how they use sustainability information to manage their businesses. We need their voice at the table to really understand what's feasible to ask of companies, the cost implications of what we're asking for, but also how they use the information in their business, because that informs the useful information for the market. We have an investor advisory group. Super important, because at the end of the day, our role is to provide decision useful information to investors. We don't know what that is unless we're talking to them. So the investor advisory group is a really important source of information. And the soon-to-be-established Sustainability Standards Advisory Forum will be a technical body of different geographical representatives who will come to the table to give us technical advice on the content of our standards to make sure they're fit for global application. Then at the bottom of this circle, we've got 2 groups which really reflect the nature of the sustainability work that we're doing. The first is the Sustainability Consultative Committee. This is a new type of committee for the Foundation and reflects the scope of the International Sustainability Standards Board's work. The Sustainability Consultative Committee has got representatives from multinationals such as the OECD and the United Nations. And the idea there is that these parties are really helpful for helping us to identify emerging sustainability risks that may not yet be on the radar of investors, but are brewing in the market. They're an early signalling system for us of upcoming sustainability issues to be on our radar. And the Jurisdictional Working Group, last but certainly not least, is a group of jurisdictions who we're working with at the moment, comprised of the UK, Europe, Japan, China, and the US. Always pleased when I get to my 5. Who are really working with us to look at the fact that we have an ED out at the moment, Europe has exposure drafts out at the moment, the US have had a climate rule proposal out at the moment, And this group is really designed to say, come on guys, how do we work together to bring these proposals closer together for the greater good? So the jurisdictional working group is all about the global baseline, and we're working really hard with them at the moment. So lots of advice. We don't have all of the answers at the board table, but we've got the mechanisms and links into the market in all of these different ways to really support the quality and the inclusiveness of our standard setting. Okay, now I'm going to move on to what we're actually hoping to achieve and what our role is in the global setup. So what's the focus of the ISSB? And you might think it's obvious, but this is a really, really important question because this entirely sets the scope of our work. So the ISSB is laser focused on meeting the needs of investors. It's investors' information needs that the ISSB is focused on, and that is a natural focus for the ISSB because it's consistent with the focus of the International Accounting Standards Board, which is focused on meeting the needs of investors. We're very interested in ensuring that investors have got a global baseline of information to help them make their investment decisions. So a global baseline, what are we talking about there? We're talking about a set of disclosures that are required that hopefully every company in the world using these standards would be providing a consistent, comparable, high quality set of information which enables them to make informed investment decisions. We want the same set of information around the world. That's why it's a global baseline, and that's because capital markets are global. Decisions are made globally. That's how we're going to affect change. And what's really important here is that this is a global baseline that is comparable. We want it to be the case that an investor picking up this information can be sure they're comparing apples and apples. If they see similarities, these are real similarities. If they see differences, these are differences that are true economic differences, not differences that arise because you are providing different disclosure requirements that make things that are the same look different or make different things look the same. And that's what's really important about this global baseline, true international comparability to inform investment decisions. We're focused on meeting the needs of investors. We really want to make sure that investors understand the risks that they're exposed to from sustainability risks, things like climate and biodiversity. How is that going to affect the company in the future? But also we want to inform investment preferences. Some investors only want to put their money with companies doing particular things or to avoid companies that are doing other things. This transparency that we provide enables an understanding of risk and informs investors to enable them to make their preference decisions. And while we talk about investors a lot, this is also beneficial for companies, particularly if you're a company that might need to provide reports in different jurisdictions. Having a comprehensive global baseline so you can use the same disclosures to meet your listing requirements or your compliance requirements in different jurisdictions is sufficient, it's effective, it's cost saving. And for me, what I like to think about is that it means that companies can focus on managing sustainability risks instead of focusing on meeting multiple reporting obligations around the world. This is an efficient and effective system for companies, and it benefits investors, which sounds pretty good to me. Now, another really important thing about our work is that we know that we don't work in isolation, and we know that it's not only investors who are interested in information about sustainability. So a really important part of the role of the International Sustainability Standards Board is to help make sure that we fit in to the broader system that is looking at sustainability reporting. And to do this, we use what we call a building block approach. Our dream is that no matter where you are in the world, there is a baseline of consistent, comparable information that's always provided to meet investors' information needs. But we know that two other things can happen. Firstly, jurisdictions can have particular disclosures that they're interested in, even if they're investor-focused. So there could be a jurisdictional interest in a piece of information that hasn't risen to being needed across the world for the global baseline. So there's jurisdictional differences. The second difference that can arise is that there are legitimate interests in information about sustainability for those beyond investors. for public policy needs, for the man on the street, for customers and others, they can also be interested in sustainability information, and those are legitimate information needs. To the extent that those are not satisfied using our global baseline, many will be, but to the extent that they are not, our dream is that the global baseline is used as the base, and then there's incremental disclosures added on that meet the particular jurisdictional or broader stakeholder needs. Again, that's an efficient and an effective system. If you're a company that both wants to meet investor needs and these other needs, by adding on incremental disclosures, it's far more efficient than applying separate disclosure regimes that have been developed in isolation. So that's the dream of the building block approach. The other source of connectivity that we're really interested in, and one that we're very fortunate to have a very good solution for, is the link between the sustainability information and the financial statements. One of the main questions I get at the moment when I talk to investors is frustration that they don't understand how what a company's saying about their carbon targets or carbon emission targets can possibly relate to what they can see in the financial statements, because there's no sign of climate risk in the financial statements. And investors are very confused about how to understand those two messages. By having the International Accounting Standards Board in the same organisation as the International Sustainability Standards Board, we've got a really unique and powerful position. The two boards can work together to ensure that the package of information that we require works well together, that it connects well together, and that we don't have any gaps or overlaps because we have the ability to work in partnership with our sister board. And this is a really powerful and important thing that we're working on at the IFRS Foundation. But I should say that we are globally focused, global baseline. Unfortunately, not every country in the world uses IFRS accounting standards. So, for example, we're drafting our sustainability standards so that if you were preparing your financial statements using US GAAP, you could still apply the International Sustainability Standards Board's requirements, and the connection will still work. So we've got a especially close relationship with the ISSB, but we are also being gap agnostic, as we call it, to ensure the global baseline is really fit for global application. So let me talk briefly about our two exposure drafts, which are out for comment until the end of July. That's my ad break. You've still got time to send me a letter to help me perfect these proposals. Now, let me talk briefly first about the overall architecture of our standards, because what's quite nice about having two exposure drafts, a set of general requirements for sustainability reporting and a specific set of proposals for climate disclosures, is that you can start to see how the suite of information that the ISSB will develop is going to evolve. So the first thing you'll see if you pick up our two exposure drafts is that there's a common thread between these two documents. Both of these documents ask companies to provide information about how a company is governing, its strategy, its risk management, and its metrics and targets to do with its sustainability risks. This is a structure that we're proposing to use throughout our standards, and those of you who are familiar with the TCFD recommendations, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, you'll know that we've shamelessly borrowed and stolen that structure from the TCFD because we think it's very good, and because the market told us to build on existing high-quality disclosures. And so we're building on that across the suite of our standards. The next thing that you can see if you pick up our documents is that the general requirements document sets the framework for the overall sustainability report that we would ask a company to provide. The climate document tells you the specific climate disclosures to provide. Over time, we'll fill out our suite of requirements to establish specific disclosures on other sustainability topics. And so that's the start of the infrastructure or the architecture for our suite of standards. So in the last few minutes I've got, I just want to highlight a couple of the key features of the general requirements and climate document, the things you really need to know about these proposals. The first is that the general requirements document sets the scene. It asks companies to provide information on all of their significant sustainability-related risks and opportunities. that are relevant to enterprise value, and I'll come back to that in a second. So we are starting out saying you need to provide us information on all of the stuff that really matters to your investors. We only have a climate set of specific requirements at the moment, so in the interim we ask companies to use our ISSB standards, the CDSB materials, and other things in the market to fill in their disclosure, their specific disclosures. Over time we'll add more specificity. But right from the start we're setting the scene saying we're interested in everything that is important for investors. And we want that to be provided in a report alongside the general purpose financial statements where you can see the connections in the information. So that's the key thing that the general requirements document establishes. The other really important thing that the general requirements document establishes is really the focus of the information that we're interested in. And this is very important because it sets the whole scene for what the new board is all about. We're asking for information that's relevant for investors, but we've got a particular focus that we're interested in. We're asking for information that's necessary to enable an investor to understand the effects of sustainability risks and opportunities on the enterprise value of a company. So what an investor needs to know today to decide whether it wants to buy shares or invest in the debt of a company and how much it would be willing to pay for it. That's what our focus is. And we explain what we mean in a more fulsome way in the document. When we talk about enterprise value, we care about future cash flows, but we care about whether you think a company is going to be able to raise capital. How attractive is it going to be given investor preferences? We also ask about the cost of capital. So we're really interested to understand not just are you going to make lots of money in the future, but also some of the investor preference aspects are coming in because we ask for a focus on the cost of capital and the ability to access finance. So that's our perspective. We ask for a focus on what's significant because we don't want companies to search for every possible sustainability risk they can imagine. It's the stuff that really matters that we want them to focus on. Often what comes up in these discussions is you're focused on investor needs, so that means you're really narrow and you don't care about the impact of a company on people, the planet and the economy. And there's a really simple answer to that. We do care about the impact of a company on people, the economy and the planet when it affects enterprise value. And increasingly, if the world at large cares about what a company is doing, an investor does. And why is that? It's because the actions of a company give rise to regulatory action. The actions of a company give rise to reputational effects. It affects whether your customers want to buy your products. It affects whether people want to work for you. It has a pervasive effect. So a lot of what would be considered traditionally impact materiality is captured in the information we require of companies because of the link to investor preference and enterprise value. And so that's a really important point about the focus of our work. And finally, we do use the word materiality, but we use it in the very traditional accounting sense. It needs to be something that matters enough that it could be reasonably certain that it would actually influence the decision that an investor would make. I don't want a data dump of every possible metric that you can imagine. I want information that really communicates to investors the stuff they need to know to make an investment decision, because that's what investors need to make sure they've seen, and they shouldn't miss it, because that's what's really important. So that's what we're trying to achieve. Now I'm going to talk for 2 more minutes, if you can indulge me, just on the climate document, given that's what most people are very, very interested in. So as I said, this is a set of specific proposed disclosures to do with climate. So it supports the general requirements document. If you look at the general requirements document and you identify climate as something that really matters for your investors, most people should, then you use our climate document to work out what exactly to disclose. And this is built on the TCFD recommendations, and we have industry-based requirements in the appendix to this document, which are built on the ISSB's industry-based requirements, which have been identified by the ISSB as being very important for investment decision-making. And we ask for information about physical risks, the risks to a company of flood risk, for example. You were talking about floods earlier on. Transition risk. Will a company need to change its business model because of regulatory change or because of the direct effects of climate change? It just can't run its business the same way. But also climate-related opportunities. Some companies have products that will be very saleable because of climate change, and investors care about upside as well. So we try to be symmetrical in that regard. We ask for information to understand how a company is planning to transition its business as a result of climate change, including what its carbon emissions targets are and how it plans to achieve them. We ask for information on how a company is thinking about its business strategy in different climate scenarios. Nobody knows how climate change is going to evolve. We want to investors want to understand how a company is thinking about what its actions would be in different climate outcomes. And last but certainly not least, we ask for scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. And this is an example of where people sometimes say, but that's an impact, not enterprise value relevant. It is enterprise value relevant, because if a company has got a high level of scope 1 emissions, it is likely to need to change the way it does its business because of regulatory restrictions and its emissions targets. And so this is one of the areas that really is a signal of high transition risk for a company if it has high GHG emissions. And so that's why it's really important for enterprise value, not just for impact. So we have a consultation period that closes at the end of July. As I said, next week we have our first board meeting. At that board meeting, we're going to give an update to the board members on what we're hearing so far in all of these meetings that we've been having about key messages on our consultation. And we hope that from September we'll be able to start discussing the feedback, and our objective is to finalise these deliberations by the end of the year, depending on the feedback that we get. So please do send us your letters or fill in the survey. Every comment helps. And with that, I did pretty well. Thank you.
I guess you can take a seat here. And we proceed with the next statement done by Professor Anna Rohlfing-Bastian. She is a professor for accounting here at the Goethe University, and she got her PhD from the University of Mannheim, then spent time at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University, was a junior professor at the WHU Otto Beisheim School of Management, and then had a professorship for managerial accounting at the University of Tübingen, and is now here, and she will basically place the discussion statement. Please.
Thank you, Katrin, and thank you, Sue, for the very insightful and clear presentation of the ISSB's works and the standards. I'd like to initiate the discussion mainly with 3 key points, 2 more general points, and 1 related to the climate disclosure. The first thing I'd like to raise as an issue is related to the building blocks approach and the uses of information. So we are at a point where the disclosure of sustainability information is becoming as equally important as the disclosure of financial information. We are putting those on the same level, basically. And I think looking at the IFRS standards, it's pretty clear that those are directed to investors. So that's information that is investor specific and also designed to fulfill investors' needs. Now, information about sustainability is something that will have many different types of uses, as you already said. And these uses are quite heterogeneous in terms of their objectives, but also in terms of their ability to read and interpret information. So for instance, also within the group of investors, there will be different targets, right? There could be those investors that want to invest their money in a way that it doesn't destroy the world. And there could be investors that are more interested in reducing the risks in their portfolio stemming from sustainability. Consumers are interested in the sustainability of the products, and firms themselves will probably use that information in order to make capital allocation and investment decisions. So at the same time, we have a situation where the sustainability information is much more complex compared to financial information. It's more subjective, and it's also more, let's say, its flavor and its assessment will differ in various contexts, in various cultures and societies. So what clashes here is we have heterogeneous users of information, and even though it's investor-specific or investor-related, the others will read it and will use it. And we have these heterogeneous users, different objectives, different perceptions and preferences, and we have this highly complex information, and this clashes together. So my question here is, the idea of a global baseline standard is very attractive, right? My question is this realizable given the multi-purpose use of sustainability information and the complexity and heterogeneity of the information itself? And maybe let me add one observation to this. The ISSB defines financial materiality as the assessment of the enterprise value, but it doesn't define who is doing the assessment. So this is left to the persons using the information. And in my view, this might lead to an expectations gap in the sense that some users of information might perceive things to be financially material that the firms themselves do not perceive to be material to them, and thus have decided to not report on them, right? Because the idea of the ISSB is, I think, quite good, that not every firm should report on everything, as you said, and you have a whole amount of data, but we should let firms decide what's material to them in order to reduce the reporting burden. Ultimately, there is a risk, I think, that the heterogeneity of information demand from different users will firms forced to report about a lot of more of these things beyond what they perceive to be financially material. My second point relates to the timing. I think everyone in this room here agrees that sustainability is without any doubt a pressing issue. And that's why it's totally understandable that the current development of sustainability standards also occur under high time pressure. However, when looking again at the parallels with financial reporting standards, the observation is that once these standards have been implemented and adopted, they create sort of a lock-in effect, right? So there might be slight changes in form of amendments to the standards, but the general standards usually remain there as they have been adopted. And this is, of course, not a negative point, right? I mean, firms basically have a very stable situation in that sense regarding the reporting. They have probably set up information structures, invested in information structures to generate the data that can be reported. So it's a good thing that there's not a daily change in the reporting requirements, right? On the other side, this observation requires a very careful and thoughtful design of the standards involving experts from different fields. Given the complexity of the subject matter I already talked about, I think the timing is very ambitious, and the consultation periods are also pretty short. And we need to make sure that the developed standards here fulfill the high informational demands of the users of information. The last point I'd like to mention is related to the metrics that you talked about in the climate exposure draft. So the climate exposure draft requires firms to disclose information about their scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And I think most people in the scientific community agree that the disclosure of scope 1 emissions really makes sense and provides useful information. However, there's also a group of researchers that has argued that the scope 3 category is somehow flawed in concept. And this is why, well, if firms need to report a reliable number of scope 3 emissions, they would be required to gather data from all its multiple tier suppliers and customers for all of its products. This would be a very complex task, right? Especially when companies do not even know the suppliers or the identity of the suppliers, probably beyond tier 1 and tier 2, leave alone their greenhouse gas emissions. So when we think about the other side, the requirement to estimate the emissions from the downstream customers is even more daunting, because companies hopefully know their immediate customers, but what happens beyond them is unknown and makes it nearly impossible to obtain accurate data. Now, there is an option to rely on industry averages or estimates of industry averages to do that. I was wondering whether this is really an option if we put the disclosed data at the same level as financial data. So, to give an example, financial reporting requires firms to disclose the cost of goods sold, their own cost of goods sold, not the industry average of cost of goods sold. So if we put sustainability reporting at the same stage as financial reporting, the data that is generated also needs to be similarly reliable. Let me close with that, and I would be happy to hear your thoughts about it, and I would also invite the audience to come up with additional questions, and I think Katrin is going to moderate that. Thank you.
We are improvising here a little bit. Okay, so please go to the front and answer.
Good points. Be my first observation, but let me share just a few reactions to your points. So, firstly, on the materiality assessments, you're right. One of the challenges is that there is a diverse range of interests, even within the investor community. I mean, they're never. Even in financial statement analysis, there's diversity in terms of what investors are interested in, et cetera, and you're right that it's probably even more diverse in the context of materiality. And so there will be challenges in the materiality assessment. One of the things that we've tried to do, though, is really, by building on the concept of materiality that we have for accounting purposes, we're at least able to borrow off the ideas there. So we already have, and so we're using the same definition, and we also have the benefit of a materiality practice statement to help guide people through how to make materiality assessments. In there, there's information about how, if you've got a diverse range of users, how do you choose which ones to focus on? Looking for common sets of users and sort of not meeting every investor need or every user need, but trying to find commonality as much as possible to cover as much as you can. And it's helpful to be able to leverage off that thinking, even though it's not an easy task. But I also think it's really important in this space, because you alluded to the fact about how dynamic this whole space is, and what investors are interested in today could be quite different to what they're interested in tomorrow, or what they're going to be interested in 2 years' time. And I think one of the things that I think is a helpful thing in terms of our design as proposed, let's see what people say, is that by saying that you need to meet the needs of investors, we've set ourselves up for dynamic materiality. So as the interests of investors change, and if more investors become interested in, thinking about preferences when they make their decisions, which means that different aspects of sustainability become increasingly important over time, our standards in a sense are set up to be dynamic and to adjust with that change, because by not identifying particular needs, but by saying meet the needs of primary users, as their needs evolve, the way you would react and the disclosures that you would provide would evolve. So I think it will be important analysis for companies, but I think it's the work is there. And in terms of the point which I think is really important that you raise, what about when investors really have needs but companies say no, they don't need it? How are we going to balance that? That's something that we're talking to ISSB about. I think we're going to probably need to think about making sure we have enough guidance to really make sure that companies understand what is important about sustainability to inform enterprise value. So we've got a good basis for that assessment, so that then is a means of challenge by assurers and others in that conversation. On timing, you're right, we need to get the balance right between quality and speed, and we're trying to do that carefully, and we will really carefully be looking at the feedback that we get. And on Scope 3, this is of course one of the areas where we're going to have to do the deepest dive, I think, in terms of the redeliberations, because there are going to be diverse views in that. For me, I think we need to think carefully about whether there's different aspects of Scope 3 that we should focus on, because there's some that's much easier to do than others, and so we need to think carefully through those steps. I think we also need to make sure that people, investors in particular, are equipped to understand what this information quality is and what its limitations are. I think sophisticated investors would say they'd rather have an estimate of Scope 3 with disclosures and information about where assumptions and estimation has been made, so that they come with open eyes in terms of what the type of information is that they're dealing with. But it's not totally unique. You also already need to think about expected credit losses, which is forward-looking. You have to look at goodwill impairments, which is forward-looking. There's other areas where there's estimation uncertainty, but we do need to make sure that is transparent. And I think what we need to be careful with Scope 3 is also, it does give rise to real transition risks for companies. Because if there are real, upstream and downstream consequences, the risk of regulatory actions that can really affect a company's business model, I think, are real. And so that's why, for me, I won't give up easily on Scope 3, although I'll be very careful to read the feedback that we get, because I think that investors do think that's important information from a transition perspective, but we need to make sure that it is there for the right reasons and that it comes with the right health warnings, and that it is practical as well. If we need to help people with how to do the estimates, we need to have a look at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's questions there. We have a little bit, I'm getting signals that we are running out of time, but nevertheless, to start the general discussion, please go ahead, and there's a microphone coming.
Thank you. Böhning-Gaese from London and Frankfurt. I was somewhat concerned in the beginning of the presentation about the notions of data dumps, and the whole idea did seem to be extremely large, and although there were continually sort of attempts to draw the subject in it a bit and to say yes and but and we want to standardize, I was still not entirely convinced, and some of the discussion has left me further unconvinced. However, what I wanted to ask about, I come to this out of pension finance, and I was talking about pension funds as responsible or socially interested investors at a conference the other day. What one was looking at was, how does this sort of dynamic materiality enter into it? Because the point that came up then was, until, let's say, 6 months ago, nobody was interested as a supposed sustainable investor in things like defence. That was written out. And all of a sudden, defence now becomes something which is part of sustainability. Equally, 6 months ago, Larry Fink was saying, I will do this, this, and this. And 3 weeks ago, or is it 4 weeks ago, Larry Fink said, I'm not going to vote anymore on investor proposals with respect to climate. So I do feel the thing is very, very dynamic, and current circumstances have just showed how dynamic it actually is. Thank you.
Who would like to answer?
I think you are right that it is very dynamic, so it does change over time. I'm not going to defend that, so which is one of the reasons why we want to make sure that we're not too constrained in terms of, because if we choose, exactly this is what has to be disclosed, and then and it's sort of a very static thing, it's not going to meet investor needs, and it's going to become out of date very soon. So we need to make, I think the dynamic materiality is something very important to consider in this space. And on the defence front, what we're trying to focus on is what's a sustainable business model and what's sustainable cash flows, et cetera, as opposed to like sustainability in sort of a taxonomy, green, good or bad sort of sense. So we're not so much focused on defence as now considered sustainable, therefore it's in. It's which risks are going to affect future cash flows and business model, etc., which is slightly different, but it's a massive communication challenge for us.
I think we have no pressing question for the moment, so we will proceed now to the first panel. I would like to thank you very much for this, I think, most wonderful introduction. It helped me as a biodiversity researcher really to understand the larger issues from the terms of finance. So I think that is setting a wonderful scene here, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the day. Thank you again.